Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this installment of Higher Education, Forgotten Pasts, and Alternative Futures. This is part of a series of panel discussions sponsored by Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education, the Critical Legal Collective, the American Association of University Professors Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom. I'm Lisa Levenstein, Professor of History and Director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at UNC Greensboro and a co-facilitator of Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education. Now, this series is intended to serve as a catalyst for the development of new democratic models of higher education as a public good. Now more than ever, as we fight to defend students, faculty, and campus workers from unprecedented attacks, we also need to proactively, and this is the idea of this series, imagine a different future for colleges and universities. And as we begin this process of rethinking what higher education can and should be, and of creating new institutional structures, we can be guided by examples of alternative practice. I'm so excited about our panel tonight on Indigenous nations and higher education, and I think it's an absolutely critical part of our ongoing thinking. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass the baton to Jeremiah Chin, who's professor of law at the University of Washington. He's going to tell you a little bit more about the panel and the speakers. They're going to speak. There's going to be time for questions. And at the end of the panel, my colleague, Isaac Kamola, at the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom will close us out. So thanks so much for being here, and I'll pass it to Jeremiah.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you all for attending and joining in. Please forgive me in advance if I make mistakes or flub up as I'm moderating these panels, because I'm just a little starstruck here with all of the amazing people that we've got in the room with us, some of whom I've had the pleasure of knowing in person and some of whom I'm meeting for the first time. So I'm very thrilled to present this panel for you, and let me introduce some of our panelists in alphabetical order. First of all, we will have hear from Megan Bang, who is a professor of learning sciences and former director of Northwestern Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. She works closely with Indigenous communities, studies the dynamics of culture, learning, and development across the life course, and the ways in which ethics and knowledge shape decision making. She designs learning environments and studies the complexities of navigating multiple meaning systems and creating and implementing more effective and just learning environments, particularly around issues of climate change and adaptation. She has taught and conducted research in teacher education as well as leadership preparation programs. Also, we are joined by Bryan Brayboy, or Brian McKinley Jones Brayboy, who was named the Dean of Northwestern University School of Education and Social Policy on June 1st, 2023. At Arizona State University, where he was previously, he was President's Professor with the School of Social Transformation and served as Vice President of Social Advancement. He also serves as a senior advisor to the president, director of the Center for Indian Education, and co-editor of the Journal of American Indian Education at Arizona State University. He's the author of more than 100 scholarly documents, and his research focuses on the role of race and diversity in higher education and the experiences of Indigenous students, staff, and faculty in institutions of higher education. We're also joined by Eva Flying. Eva is Chief Dull Knife College's sixth sitting president and the first woman to occupy this role. She is deeply rooted in the southeastern Montana and northern Cheyenne communities and is a champion of enhancing lives through health and education. Eva has spent a considerable amount of her professional career establishing and managing health and wellness programs at higher education institutions. She appreciates the importance of tribal college movement and has been personally involved. Being the first woman college president, she is already creating a path for young Cheyenne women to pursue their dreams, and her presence in the college leadership role is creating new pathways for all people to believe in the mission that Chief Dull Knife College instills. We are also joined by Sandy Grande. Sandy Grande is a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous studies at the University of Connecticut. Across her work, she aims to produce a more nuanced analysis of the colonial present. Her current project is on Indigenous elders and aging. She received support from the Ford Foundation and the Yukon Humanities Institute to support this work. Her first book, Red Pedagogy, Native American Social and Political Thought, was published in the 10th anniversary edition, and a Portuguese translation is anticipated to be published in Brazil in 2026. In addition to her academic and organizing work, she provided elder care for her parents for over 10 years and served as a primary caregiver for her father until his passing at the age of 97. And then last but certainly not least, and one of my personal favorites, Amanda Tachine, is Navajo from Ganado, Arizona. She is an assistant professor in educational studies at the University of Oregon. Amanda's research explores the relationship between systemic and structural histories of settler colonialism and the ongoing erasure of Indigenous presence and belonging in college settings using qualitative Indigenous methodologies. She's the author of the award-winning book Native Presence and Sovereignty in College and co-editor of Weaving Otherwise in Relations Methodological Practice. Among other scholarly outlets, she has published in Marvel, The Hill, Teen Vogue, Indian Country Today, and Navajo Times, where she advances ideas regarding discriminatory actions, educational policies, and inspirational movements. So thank you all for joining this incredible panel of geniuses and experts today to really think about the role of the university, not only in the present, but also in the past and the future. And so I want to ground us in the title and the name that kind of brought us all here together of Forgotten Past and Alternative Futures by first laying some foundation and some groundwork. So the first question I'll try my best to moderate and keep track of time, though cutting off either Bryan Brayboy or Sandy Grande sounds like something I never want to do. So I'm going to turn first to Bryan and Sandy and ask from your perspective as both like not only geniuses, but esteemed scholars in the history of Indigenous education, especially within higher education and the United States. For people who know less or are just learning about the histories of Indigenous education and the education of Indigenous peoples as distinct kind of practices, what would be the most important piece that you would want for someone to build a foundation for understanding today? And so I'll go alphabetically and turn first to Dr. Brayboy, Bryan.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. It's good to see you. And I want to thank AAUP for hosting us and for the invitation, and the fellow panelists for allowing me to be with you, and for you, Dr. Chen, for overseeing this. I'm going to jump right into this, and I'm going to share what I think is a really important way to think about higher education in native nations in particular. I really appreciate that piece of it. So in 1744, Haudenosaunee peoples, which are often referred to as Iroquois, the Iroquois Confederacy now, were having a meaningful set of conversations with the government of what would become Virginia, and thinking about um, negotiating that treaty. And it's important that we're talking about native nations because treaties are fundamentally agreements between equals. The US was not yet established. I think sometimes people don't entirely understand, one, that it was really this fledgling set of colonies that were asking permission from native peoples to exist in their own right, but also that higher education had already been a thing for us. So this comes from a 1784 retelling from Benjamin Franklin, who was there. This happens in 1744, and I'm just going to read parts of this to you because I think it's so important to think about relational issues between Indigenous peoples and nations, and not just higher education, but the government itself. So this is Franklin's telling of this. After the principal business was settled, the commissioners from Virginia acquainted the Indians by a speech that there was at Williamsburg a college with a fund for educating Indian youth, and that if the chiefs of the Six Nations would send down half a dozen of their sons to that college, the government would take care that they would be well provided for and instructed in all the learning of the white people. Franklin goes on to say it's traditional in tribal communities and native communities to take some time on this. So he goes on to say they, meaning the Haudenosaunee, therefore deferred their answer till the day following, when their speaker began by expressing his deep sense of their kindness of the Virginia government in making them that offer, for we know, says he, that you highly esteem the kind of learning taught in those colleges, and that the maintenance of our young men while with you would be very expensive to you. We are convinced, therefore, that you mean to do us good by your proposal, and we thank you heartily. But you who are wise must know that different nations have different conceptions of things, and you will therefore not take it amiss if our ideas of this kind of education happen to not be the same as yours. We've had some experience of it. Several of our young people were formerly brought up at the colleges of the northern provinces. They were instructed in all your sciences, but when they came back, they were bad runners, ignorant of every means of living in the woods, unable to bear either cold or hunger, knew neither how to build a cabin, take a deer, or kill an enemy, spoke our language imperfectly, were therefore neither fit for hunters, warriors, or counselors. They were totally good for nothing. We are, however, not the less obliged by your kind offer, though we decline accepting it. And to show our grateful sense of it, if the gentlemen of Virginia will send us a dozen of their sons, we will take great care of their education, instruct them in all we know, and make men of them. So I think this is a really important way to think about higher education and to really just pose a couple of questions for us to think about. One is, I think if we think about what's happening in 2025 and moving toward 2050 and 2084, there's a lot of wisdom in what Haudenosaunee leaders say here, really around what assumptions do we make about the benefits of college schooling. And I don't say higher education here because it's really fundamentally about the schooling aspects of what happens in higher education, not the educational pieces of this. How do we work through differences in the conception of things, which are continue to be fraught? We can see the state of higher education and the current battles and narratives around what purposes does higher education serve, what purposes does the schooling serve, and how do we think about it? And again, thinking about that purpose. I think what's critical here for me is Haudenosaunee's um, not just responding to the request, but actually doubling it. So it's half a dozen of their men. They offer to take a dozen of settlers' sons and make men of them. But you can really begin to see, like, we should start thinking about it's not just hunters and warriors, but the idea of counselors really gets at the fullness and wholesomeness of what tribal nations were really looking for in terms of thinking broadly about higher education and moving away from schooling. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my friend, Dr. Sandy Grande.
Thank you, Bryan. It's so nice to be in conversation with everybody here and with our guests. And thank you for organizing us, Isaac and Kate and Dr. Chin. Always wise words from Dr. Brayboy. I'll just sort of build on that theme a little bit and say, or underscore maybe, that absolutely what we understand as the university today was clearly founded through indigenous dispossession. And I'll talk a little bit more about, we talk about dispossession a lot, but I want to unpack that a little bit in a minute. But even almost 150 years prior to that story that Bryan just shared with us, the founding of Harvard, the first university in what is now the US, was really the beginning of the pattern that progressed from that day forward up until today, clearly 200 years later with the Haudenosaunee, but also today. And a couple of things to pull out. One, I think really focusing on dispossession as the means through which, indigenous dispossession as the means to which universities was founded. What that means initially is that once Harvard, higher education at that time was not something that everybody was supported as like a wild venture in some ways. So from the time of the conception of Harvard as a college to train, eventual priests or whatever, and clergy, it took 50 years. They opened with no building, no, nothing really. It was an idea. And they weren't having any success in raising money until nearly 50 years later. Once it became pretty clear that Indigenous genocide and land dispossession was quite taxing on what was emerging as the settler state. This idea, this sort of radical idea that maybe the savages could be civilized. And that was appealing. So the university was also always a global venture. So global corporations like the Virginia Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, were literally in the business of converting savages to civilized. That was a business venture. So when proposed with like this idea of university charters, it appeared to them to be more efficient and certainly less expensive in the vernacular of today, like a greater ROI, right? To profit from civilizing in the way they couldn't from genocide. So I was talking 1636. 200 years later, they didn't. So Harvard put education of Indian youth into the charter. Suddenly they started to attract investors. It took 200 years for them to graduate a Native student. So, they sort of siphoned the money, the investment for what was to be an Indian college to build Harvard. And then there was no commitment to Native students, even 200 years later to graduate the first student. So what does this history tell us about today, I guess, is, and getting to some of the questions that Bryan posed. I think for me, it's really common to hear or to kind of hear a talk or discourse today around the university being in crisis, or the university failing, or other critiques of the university being historically white or Eurocentric or whatever it is. But to name what's happening today in the university as a crisis or a failure, I think is really a disavowal of settler history. And that this history of dispossession, the way it animates, I think, a really different political project, parallel, but different political project than when we're trying to animate justice projects around racial oppression or class oppression. But I think this history of dispossession, if it does anything, I think it really spotlights for me our responsibility to think beyond the horizons of diversity, equity, inclusion. That certainly those things are important. But we need to think about the difference, I think the critical difference of dispossession and the kinds of political interventions it requires, beyond, again, sort of DEI interventions. And then the last thing I'll say is when that dispossession, I hope we talk about this later, that dispossession of land isn't just about the materiality of land and land being gone, or land being siphoned to others, I guess, is that you're also erasing the relations that come with land. So not just land as a materiality, but land as a set of relations, as a logic, as an episteme. And so it's really a erasure of a whole way of knowing that is still not present in the university as we understand it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Sorry, I was too busy taking notes to unmute my microphone because, when Professors Brayboy and Grande are talking, you take notes. And so I just so appreciate that foundation that we're starting from in thinking about not only the relational issues between what education might mean for different communities, but also the role of dispossession in higher education. And I especially appreciate the way that Sandy was highlighting, the loss of DEI is also a part of this dispossessory interest of the university, right? The dispossession of land, but the land is more than just the physical item, it's the relationships that go along with it. And we've spent a lot of time, I think, frustrated and grieving what we're losing or what we've assumed to be present and lost, whether that is federal funding, which I know has happened to a lot of pretty much every university across the nation, or the loss of a particular set of assumptions that we had that were really only relatively new, right? DEI is a concession, really, from the programs of reparations that the university claimed they were going to enact. beforehand. So I want to turn from this foundational past into the futures that we're seeing, whether those are positive futures, alternative futures, great futures. This doesn't have to be, sunshine, rainbows, and roses to say that, like, oh, there's going to be everything's going to get better, don't worry about it. But as we are worrying and thinking through this time, I think it's really important to ground ourselves in what we are actually trying to achieve and what are we building towards, or even just understanding where we're headed. And so for the next set of discussion points from our panelists, I'm hoping folks can think about what obstacles are currently in existence towards these futures that we want to create, what these futures might look like, and what's being constructed from the possibilities. Stuff like, we're worried about accreditation, and there's a lot of controversies about the different accrediting bodies. What does it look like for universities to be in relationship with indigenous nations that we could think about accreditation differently, right? What are the possibilities that exist there? So I want to first, for this second half of the panel and envisioning and thinking about the futures and barriers to those futures, I want to first turn to Megan Bang and ask what you see ahead of us and what you envision.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My major lesson for tonight is don't follow Bryan and Sandy. Just to say that, because part of what and I'm also really just grateful to be here. Thank you to everybody. One of the things that I want to elevate about what I think and where I wanted to start that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how much when we don't understand that education has been a primary tool, we often talk about it as the primary tool of genocide, which is true. It is also the primary tool of empire building. And I think in the US right now, what we are not always holding is the ways in which we may have been participating in a US-centric empire building, and what that meant for global orders. And so I just want to extend a little bit about what I've heard both Bryan and Sandy say that the current forms of education focused on Western epistemes was about creating the current nation-state global order at the expense of indigenous global orders, right? And ways of governing. So I think that becomes really important, because part of, as we think about, even if we want to think about reparations, or we want to think about a more just US, the current fantasies of the US are predicated on harming the earth and other people in other places. An American middle class is not a sustainable and just structure of society. So I feel like that was true way before the current moment. But part of what I think is happening, and I'll just say this and then I'll try to move from this, is while we can talk lots about the real repression and the authoritarianism that is rapidly building, it is also an old story of controlling knowledge and controlling a moral and ethical infrastructure so that governments can do what they want to do. It's not really it's just people are waking up to the realities of it differently, or some people are. And part of what I want to say about that, for me, the futures holds the possibility for us not to grieve a perhaps hope or a misguided theory of change we may have been participating in. And I would just say that, like, I sometimes think that we're learning a hard lesson about a misguided theory of change that we've been participating in. To say, like, what if some of this is routinized, what is opening and possibility? And I'll say I am personally concerned that the ways in which higher ed is being remade, and I would just offer, so is K-12, but K-12 has about a 20-year head start on privatization in particular kinds of ways, is about restructuring a financial system for knowledge development and control. And it's always been there. It's just getting way more explicit in particular ways. And so I just think we really have to imagine what is a higher education that is actually for our thriving and for potential, like, future worlds where things like planetary well-being sustainable and just ways of living, like what is the education for actually cultivating that? And, you know, over the last 20, 25 years, the explicitness with which education is for adult labor only, right? I think we like to pretend that some notion of education for democracy is like a real thing. I have real questions whether education ever was that, or if it was always the aspirational dream. And I think we're just seeing that happen. And I think that one thing that I'll say is a barrier before I say one last thing is university is at the forefront of remaking law and legal order. At the same time, it's remaking educational, and I would argue thought order. And in my own personal experience right now, I am watching university lawyers reconstruct what tribal sovereignty means, what trust responsibility means as they think about things like what is allowable and what is not. And we can talk about the loss of academic freedom. Honestly, academic freedom was never fully realized by most of us. Like that's just not, it's just not a real pretense, maybe in aspirational ones. But there is a rapid reordering of what it means to understand Indigenous peoples, tribal sovereignty, and trust responsibility by the ways in which universities are reconstructing what is allowable on campus and what is not. And that worries me a lot. It worries me a lot that there is this other infrastructure. I'll also say that's always been the case in education, right? We talk about education as a tool of genocide, but it also structures a social order. Part of the challenges is that at least K-12 has created a United States that doesn't know anything about Native people, or it knows a stereotype or pre-1900. That's a social infrastructuring of mind that is happening, and there's a rapid redoing of that. So those are my worries. Here's what I'll say. I think that the opportunity is for tribal nations to imagine self-determining education differently and to really have to press beyond a kind of US-centered sovereignty and imagine what higher ed looks like in relation to other nations outside of the nation states that a lot of our communities end up first framing around. And just to say, some of this work has been in motion for decades already, right? Like Indigenous communities have already been up to this in some ways. And I wonder about the opportunity to actually just get pretty bold about that. And recognize that there are communities that have been and institutions that have already been up to it. So I get a little bit like we should keep up to what we've been up to and not mourn or be misled by a grieving of systems that we were all after transforming anyway. And I just think that for broader folks, that might be hard because I don't know that they recognize the extent to which our systems needed to be remade anyway. And I'll stop there.
Sheyam and a Tachine inisha, Nanish at a Tachine, Dishlo, is a son of Bashishi, Tkomahanda Shechayado, and she had the Shandala, look Antia Danasha. It's good to be here today. I just wanted to just say a big thank you to AAUP. One of my mentors is Dr. Gary Rhodes, who was former General Secretary of AAUP. In fact, I'm holding his recent book right now, Organizing Professionals, Academic Employees Negotiating in the Academy. And it's timely. And I want to begin with this because Dr. Rhodes has shared with me over and over as I was a grad student and now as a faculty, his colleague, about the power of collective organizing and the power of AAUP and doing and enacting that. And the cover of the picture actually is a photo of a 1912 strike at a textile company where a woman was quoted as saying, "We want bread," which is wages, "but we want roses, respect, too." And I like to think about the time in which that happened in 1912 was also a time when my late grandfather was born on Navajo land, when settlers coming to where I'm from, Lukantia, and when changing of life was happening on the nation state where I reside from. And so I'm thinking about all of this, the power of collective organizing in a time we're here. And it drew me to how this has happened within Indigenous peoples. And so Brock University, in fact, in June 2020, did their collective bargaining with Indigenized people. And now that shook me up. So they actually met with Indigenized folks in the university and put it as part of their collective bargaining to ensure that Indigenous knowledge system was infused into the next line of items that is needed for tenure, for indigenizing faculty and staff. So it gives the idea that it's possible and universities can enact that. I love, Megan, how you talked about academic freedom is questionable. And Dr. Rose has also shared with you also the academic freedom, but what I can trouble with that is the individualized state that often entails, which limits tribal sovereignty and tribal review board, and the way that some of us are coming with tribal knowledge and approval from our community that's not individualized but collective in nature. So I want to think about what that means for us in this time. In the beginning of his book, he says, now is the time. And I want to say that right here on September 24th, 2025, now is the time. And so I want to share a quote that is really fits to this idea of now is the time. By our wonderful, knowledge holder, Linda Tuiwa Smith, states that one of the strategies that Indigenous peoples have employed effectively to bind people together politically as that people imagine a future, that they rise above present day situations, which are generally depressing, dream a new dream, and set a new vision. And this reminds me of a text that I had one time with my good friend, Natalie Diaz, and we were chuckling over, gosh, we got to learn our old songs. I want to learn some of my old Diné songs, and I want to teach that to my children. But we were also talking about, but there's an opportunity to learn new songs. And there's an opportunity for us to learn what that is. And I want to envision and lock arms with Dr. Tuiwa Smith about these new dreams and a set of new visions and a set of new songs that is happening right now, and has always been. So Robin D.G. Kelly also reminds us that without these new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused and rudderless and cynical, but we forge that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. And that's the part of this work. And I see this at institutions, at tribal colleges, at institutions across the United States, this nation state, is that it's transforming us. And so one thing that I take from my Diné teachings is that I use a language of systemic monsters as the ways that whiteness operates and that reifies the conditions that we are in and these status quo conditions. And so these systemic monsters also can teach us, if we pay attention and we slow down, to what is the new visions and what are the tools that we need to navigate this time. And so I just want to talk about, in Diné ways, our word for future is Nasko. Nasko. I asked my mom, Nasko, Mom, what does that mean? And Nasko is forward. And so my husband, who's also speaks Navajo fluently, I was talking to him, I said, Nasko. And he said, Nasko is like taking one step forward. It's like moving forward in a forward direction. And some of you, if you've ever been to a tribal game, basketball for us is huge. We hear grandmothers say, Yego. They're yelling that out, all that Yego. And there's like fire in that go-ness, Yego. To me, it's like persistence. Nasko is future. And I want to lean into that this is now is the time is to look at these challenges, these systemic monsters, and make a new vision and a new song for us as we move forward. This morning, I was listening to Bone Thugs. And one of the songs I was listening to is, if I could teach the whole wide world to live in thug and harmony. And one of the lyrics of that is, I'm holding to my soul, but nobody knows when it's all unfolds. So I'm holding on to my soul but nobody knows what it all unfolds is what's happening right now, is what's unfolding. And it reminds me of Cheryl Crazy Bull, who's also a mentor and leader with tribal colleges. And she told us about a month or so ago is that we need to be ready right now. And she was speaking to tribal college presidents and leaders. And I'm so lucky Eva's here to speak next. And so we're talking in these tumultuous times. And she says, we need to be ready. And we've always been ready. That's Indigenous ways, is to be ready and as things unfold. And so now is the time, and I think that this is a time for us to be ready and to think about our collective organizing in that capacity. And so here's the last, I want to end with this poem by M.S. Red Cherries, an Indigenous writer. And the poem is Making New Millennia. Last night I dreamed in color, riding scars, bearing us, carrying us up and down to farther destination. With a beautiful bow is what we were. Told you, grab Sunday's imagination of beholding, and beholding tries its best to party.
Wow, let's hold space for that for a second. Super powerful. And MS Red Cherries is also Northern Cheyenne from our community. And I just want to give a shout out to Marissa, another tribal member of Northern Cheyenne. And good evening, everyone. I want to thank you guys for allowing me to be part of this panel. It just gives me chills to have this discussion and be part of what we are talking about. I'm Eva Flying. I'm the president for Chief Dull Knife College. I'm entering my 4th year. We are part of the TCU 34 colleges, part of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, group of land grant institutions recognized by the government in 1994. Again, hold space, 1994, of when we were given, let's say, again, funding in support of tribal education. And so bringing to this conversation is just a number of playing off of what Dr. Brayboy, what Megan have said, and that too is time for me to take notes and talking about who are we preparing? Are we preparing them for them, or are we preparing them for us? And a lot of the work that I build on is preparing us. And so when I think about the threats, we hear, constantly about what the cuts are, what the meaning is of that, but those are lived experiences that we face hourly, daily, in conversation. And they don't even have to be spoken conversations. You can just, get that look and be like, I'm having a hard time. This is really impacting me right now. Just on Friday, and making it personal in context, what we experience, Department of Ed is cutting project success. Project success for our institution is student aid, emergency aid, internships, IDC funding to be able to operate. And so we're addressing that with the people in DC to make sure that, is this really what you want to do? Because that seems to be the same knee-jerk reaction that we have been faced with in the last few months of, is the money there? What's going to happen? And so with the loss of funding, we also have other local systems that, again, want to say, be like us. Be like us, do our numbering system, do our Common Core. But as we stand in who we are as a tribal college, our numbers are our numbers. Our data is our data. And so do we enter into agreements of 2+2 programs? Yeah, we do. But we make sure that we keep our numbering system.
moving into opportunity, I hope you've seen in the media recently the economic impact that we did roll out in the last few weeks, and that was data from 2022, 2023. And with that, I'll just show my, not my slides, but just my buttons. What tribal colleges have contributed in terms of the financial return on investment, those returns. $3.8 billion is what we contribute to our economies. And when we equate it to who we educate, we're educating nations, we're educating families, we're educating future generations. And so for the state of Montana and where we are located on the reservation is rural Southeast Montana. And we are split between 2 different counties. And if you take into consideration and context what the pandemic did and what services were provided, how we contribute to who our state is in rural ranching, farming, economies, mining, of natural resources and things like that. Tribal colleges have contributed total impact $332.2 million to our economy. In terms of jobs supported, let's say 5,178 jobs. So do we bring home the bacon? Yeah, we do. We support what we're putting out in terms of education for our students and our communities. But that doesn't come without a cost. There's a plus side, there's a downside to the reprogramming of funds. And so earlier this year, we were potentially being cut 91%, and that would have closed our doors. But within the last 3 weeks, we've heard different things coming down for different types of funding sources where it not only takes money from other institutions, but brings money to our institution. And so that eases our hearts, knowing that we will be receiving funding. But when our students go to transfer to those other institutions, where will they go? Who will they work with? Who's going to be there for them? Because like Dr. Brayboy said, we're trusting you with our babies. And what are they going to have when they get to that institution next? And let me see what else. You know, for our tribal college and what we think about with the adult labor and workforce, why we are in existence, that was how it was started. We were started as trade and technical schools, but now we have PhDs, we have master's programs, bachelor's, certificates, meeting the needs and what our communities are asking for, what they need. And so I really appreciate how Megan put it into context because those are aspirational dreams. Those are long-lasting pieces to building identity through culture, and that's what the tribal college is founded on, our language and our culture. So thank you.
As Megan said, trying to follow anyone in this panel is hard. I want to say just a few things and then kind of be quiet because I'm interested in questions that might come up. Part of what I want to say is I think that higher education is inherently optimistic in some ways. I think that Megan and Sandy have kind of pointed to the cynical pieces of this that I actually don't disagree with. But I think for me, I tend to think about higher education as being optimistic and forward facing. It's focused on futures and on serving the planet in some instances. Our students at Northwestern just started 2 weeks ago, and watching young people run around with Class of 29 on the back of their shirts is one physical manifestation um, of this. And so I think that for me, the forward facing pieces of this sometimes is on redefining futures for particular kinds of people and classes of people. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence that part of what elite institutions do is really just reify a social order. And I think that's for us something important to really wrestle with and struggle with. I also happen to think that there are that our institutions are also about possibility and about, to Amanda's point, about making and singing new songs. I look at the work of my colleagues like Megan and Sandy and Jeremiah and Eva and Amanda, and I think I want to do the kind of work that they're doing that's creating the conditions for Indigenous peoples to thrive. There's a large set of issues here that we've got to wrestle with, but I think if we come back to these questions that we've been asking and that Eva is asking us to think about, which is, are we prepping students for them or for us? And I think to the extent that we start preparing students, one, for themselves, but two, as part of a larger collective toward a well-being of their communities, of larger society, of the planet, there's an opportunity here potentially for us to kind of reimagine a new theory of change that I think Megan is calling us to move toward. I'm not suggesting it's an easy thing. I will say to you that I was part of along with a woman named Elizabeth Sumida Waman, or Ellie, a few years ago, working with Carnell Chosa at the Santa Fe Indian School. We created a doctoral program for Pueblo students and Navajo students and for doctoral students. And what they've done with their degrees is really fundamentally serve their communities and the places and the peoples where they live. And so for me, that's the hope of possibility, is thinking about what those graduates were able to do. And part of our job in working with Carnell in developing this was really to create the conditions for people to be able to serve, to create futures of their own making, to create the conditions for their communities to thrive. And it's those things where I want us to be aware of the challenges in front of us, but I also want us to think about what is it that we might do differently, working toward a theory of change that's rooted in a collective, in a whole, in a focus on the planet and the well-being of lands and waters.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to be super quick because I also would love to get to the questions. I'm going to say maybe a couple of things. I don't think the university as such, as we know it, is transformable, but I also think it's okay. I think it was founded for a very particular purpose, as we've talked about. It's clearly changed over time. And when I say the university, I mean the settler university, because that's what it is, and that's what it was, and that's what it is. Wasn't designed for Native peoples. And again, I think that's okay in a sense. I think in its best, if it's living its best life and its best self, as in the image or the ideal of the liberal institution, it can continue to do good things in the world. I think more about building alongside, I guess, sort of the Harney and Moten notion of kind being in but not of the university. I think when we're living in a time, I also think about the issues of explanatory power. So, at one point, perhaps the South University served its own purpose if it's building a nation and building empire, then building an institution that would support those desires, focused on change, logics of change, logics of production, in many ways future oriented, made sense. or had a certain amount of explanatory power. Right now, when, by even the most conservative estimates, the condition of global groundwater, maybe another 20, 25 years. I don't know that a system built on uncritical futures, on productivist logics makes a lot of sense. So I think to build something alongside, I think also of Robin Kelly, I like that he was called into the room, that the idea of fighting over but not for the university. In other words, not joining into the fight to save whatever this project was, but over the idea that was never fully realized. And to work with Indigenous peoples and communities in ways that they've been working all along, which people have marked on a very different but parallel kind of way of being in the world. And I think students beyond Native students are really hungry for a very different system of thinking and learning and being. I see it in my classes all the time. So many other things are contesting the university and kind of the old models, everything from AI to social media to God only knows what's coming next. So I don't know that those modes of learning and thinking and being and teaching are really servicing us much anymore. So I think at least I try to be careful to not necessarily invoke either the binaries of optimistic, pessimistic, good, bad, living, dying, even, that they're all part of cycles of change and transformation in worlds that have existed long before us and will exist long after us. So I'll stop there. Hopefully get to the questions.
I was finishing up my notes. Thank you everybody for your comments. If people could start dropping their questions in the chat, then I can pose them to the panel and sort through them. I just want to take a minute because we are impressively and gratefully ahead of our planned time. So we do have substantial time for Q&A and for crosstalk, honestly, among the panelists in reacting and responding to one another. I think you all have already done a wonderful job of it, but there's just so many excellent ideas and quotables coming from tonight's discussion. I've been thinking a lot about, there was a labor organizer who was in Utah in the early 20th century by the name of Joe Hill, and he was executed by the state because he would not name names of who were also in the IWW, and he was accused of murder, and they would have given him an out and blah, blah, blah. But before his execution, his last words were, "Don't mourn, organize." And I feel like Megan has given a education version of that to us tonight. Like, don't mourn these oppressive or be misled by systems we were already seeking to transform, right? Like, we're mourning the loss of something that wasn't designed for us and that wasn't created for us. So then, what time can be spent instead of mourning on imagining those other possibilities? But I think that the conversation tonight has really reminded us that imagining doesn't have to be a fantasy world where we don't acknowledge what's actually present. We acknowledge the lived reality of what we experience, and then we're taking that and we're transforming that into something beneficial, right? And that involves this like ingenious ingenuity that we've heard from our panelists today of how do we take these systems that were used and weaponized against us and make them for something better and something that actually serves the communities that it was out there to harm. And so I just want to take a second to just appreciate all of the panelists who have talked today, and also give time for folks in the chat to drop more questions in, because we have a couple. But first, I want to give the platform to any of the panelists who want to add on to a thought that you heard from one of your fellow panelists, or feel motivated to bring out before we get into the audience Q&A.
I just want to, I think that one of the things, Sandy said this, right? 25 years of groundwater. we have a couple of decades of a current food system that's rapidly collapsing depending upon where you're located. For many people in the world, the food system is already collapsing. And so I also think that one of the things is for us to actually be disciplined in imagining scales of futures that we're talking about. I think one of the things that happens to us here is that we either think about change at the scale of full-scale transformation, which, by the way, no revolution ever totally happened that way, right? It wasn't burn it down in a day and the new world is rebuilt the next day. That's not actually a livable or real theory of change or an example of history that's happened. The other thing that I think is really important about this is that our horizons for futures are often located within one human lifespan. And that is a uniquely Western way to think about futures that I think we have to be really careful about. Now, my kids and my students will rightly demand change now. That's true. And, right, like I think that my ethical responsibility is to say, how do I prepare young people with the reality of 25 years of groundwater or food systems that have narrowed this, and do it in such a way that actually they see the possibility in it. And one of the ways that I think about this personally is that, you know, my big pie in the, well, my big way of thinking about things is that the global reordering that has happened, that what we're calling dispossession, is actually changed the corporeal arrangements of everyday life at micro scales, literally how our bodies are on and with lands, waters, and each other, to the point that you can see the devolution of our physical well-being, never mind our mental, our spiritual, our emotional well-beings, right? Like those things are actually co-constructed. And so in some ways, if we think about this moment as a kind of multiverse collapsing that also makes visible all of these different dimensions, there's actually a kind of potential ethical clarity about what it is that's, I'm going to say it like this, worth our breath. But I think it helps clarify a little bit of what and how we do things. And you know, to me, Amanda, the idea of singing new songs is a really beautiful thing, particularly if we hold what the power of song is. And like when we start to understand that, do our forms of life generate future life? That there's a way in which to ask, right? That and I think that Sandy, your point about that at one point the logics might have made sense, but they don't make sense for anyone anymore, right? They don't make sense for for the earth anymore. And so I think being serious about that is actually a remarkably like freeing and like almost overwhelming to the possibilities of making if we're willing to see it that way.
Absolutely. And also, I feel like what we've been confined to think about, you brought up the conversation about generationally, like we think one generation. I also think about the ways in which we think about one world, the one world concept. And so, what is it like to have multiple worlds? How can you be engaged with the institution and then with your community all at one time? And so, I think there's also a possibility that we need to imagine multiple worlds that's operating at one time and multiple worlds that are being created at one time. Because I think we can close off our imagination when we think of that one concept of one generation and one world. And so when I'm thinking about new visions, I had to tell myself that because I'm thinking of my multiple worlds that I'm carrying as a mother, as now a grandmother, as a teacher, and then as a community person. Like I'm living these multiple worlds, and like, how am I then envisioning a future, a new song in these multiple worlds, and recognizing that there's some worlds that I don't have energy for. Like I'm shutting down some of those worlds, and like, and rightly so. I think it's okay to do that. And so I just want to acknowledge the multiplicity world making that we can do, and there's an urgency to do that. And it's taking us then modes of thinking and ways of knowing that may be different from what we're accustomed to. So thanks for bringing that up, Nick. I just wanted to just build off of your thinking.
Just
I
want to
think
say,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
just want to say, Amanda, thank you for that. And some of our own cosmologies always have, you know, multiple worlds operating all the time. For sure in Quechua, Hanan Pacha, Kai Pacha, Ukupacha are all worlds always in motion all the time. And so it's, I think when you think about the possibilities of that, yeah, it's easier to imagine, I guess, parallel systems. And then also, you know, drawing upon, you know, our own indigenous languages and ways of being, I think is really critical to the whole entire process. And in addition to kind of not necessarily be wedded to a temporal frame or one by time, whether it's generation or 7 or 13 generations or whatever people use, what it means to be organized spatially or both at the same time. You know, for us, actually, future is behind us because we can't see it. So it has a spatial situatedness as opposed to temporal. But also the notion of humility, like we as humans are only one piece of the pie. So I'm not sure what I think about the whole notion of world making because that's very, in some ways, very anthropocentric, very human centric, very productive centric. Like we got to be doing and busy all the time. I say that as somebody who's doing and busy all the time. So, you know, I don't know. There's just a lot to always think about.
Well, I want to, first of all, again, thank our panelists for the extra additional discussion and the multiple worlds that are being invoked. And so I want to try and synthesize some of the questions that I've seen in the comments into that multiple worlds kind of framing, because there have been folks thinking about multiple or alternative worlds, because you know, a lot of our conversation is centered around the United States federal government and its transformation, or you know, its unmasking, whatever, however we want to conceptualize it, and the relationship of universities. But there's also relationships to tribal governments that are but huge sources of potential, also potentially fraught in many ways. Given that, you know, there's a question that, you know, we understand that Native vote went predominantly Democratic in the last election, but we also know that there are tribal governments that are deeply conservative in other ways, that not in a traditional Republican Democrat sort of framework. What does the potential of turning to tribal governments or indigenous governments outside of the U.S. federal government framework look like for you? Is that just a reheating of the ways in which that institutions relate to higher education now? Is that an alternative pathway that has potential? Just kind of a Band-Aid on things? I'd be interested to know what any of the panelists have to think about that.
I think that's my question. And it's a hot topic, and it's alive in my community as we're here. And so it is very politically heated. I'm trying to be choose my words, because we have instances in our tribal government, our tribal council, our tribal president currently, and we are chartered by our tribe, and the way that we operate is to, for accreditation purposes, have a governance system that is at an arm's length from tribal politics. And so the things that are happening with those two pieces of our government would jeopardize the accreditation piece if it were to be swayed one way or the other. And so when we talk about accreditation and we talk about tribal sovereignty and we bring in what is best for the institution, and that's the piece that I hold. What is best for the institution? How do I ensure that we protect our students, our community, as well as uphold our responsibilities of this is a safe space, this is a free space to express and learn about your views. We are going to be celebrating 50 years in 2029. And so building that, thank you, is a lot of tribal leaders, a lot of community that have been able to both teach here and learn from us. And so I think when we talk about the tribal leadership and ownership of who we are and how we see ourselves function and operate, I can't speak for the rest of the country, but knowing for what we want and what we're hoping to have into what comes next is that we're safe, we're protected, and that we're moving in directions that are going to help our community. Cheyenne value, Cheyenne culture, we operate on a different system, just like, Amanda has mentioned in how we know, the same as Sandy, of how we believe. And so this is what we're living today. And it's a hard topic. I'll say that. It comes with a lot of emotion, that at a tribal college, it's not separate because we are all in the same community, same proximity, same households. And so I'll leave it there.
What I also want to echo off of Eva's great work is that alongside, one of the things that I find value in working with tribes and in Arizona is the power of Indigenous data sovereignty that they're teaching us. And I feel like that is really timely, when IES and when all the data sets that we often look to in the federal sets were gone. I mean, literally were gone. I went to the website and fast facts data that I pulled from were gone. It was like a Thanos incident. It's like a flip like this and they were gone. But tribes then are like, well, those measurements in many ways don't measure what our values are, what's important to us. And so now, like, being alongside tribes and helping them, and alongside my good friend and colleague Jameson Lopez, we're working with tribes on what do you value, and tribal colleges like Eva, like, what do you value? How are we measuring towards that? And let's create our data that is needed to tell the story we needed. And so those are opportunities that I find around governance and data governments and data sovereignty, of what are the values that our communities need that are beyond persistent in enrollment rates and graduation rates, that takes to the values of our languages, our languages occurring. Our Native tribal leaders are like, we want our students to be happy and healthy. That's we did a study, and that's what they're asking. So how are we measuring whether our students are happy and healthy at these institutions? And so those are the ways in which I think there's promise and possibilities of, in these times of like unprecedented moments of data gone. All right, let's build. Let's get new vision. Let's build our data sets for ourselves to build the infrastructure for generations unfolding of what is values, and are we creating our own data infrastructure? And that gives me excited. And the reason why I do this work is because there's possibilities there. And Eva is doing a great job at her college and doing this work. She's teaching me, her and her colleagues. And it's just been a wonderful. Yeah, Eva.
You know, one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about as I do work in the Great Lakes and think a lot about what does it mean to prepare our young people and to think about what's happening to our lands and waters and to navigate a future that isn't defined by climate grief and climate loss, right? Is, you know, this may not be true for everybody, but Anishinaabe people's sovereignty wasn't divided up by our bands that are currently the ways that sovereignty structures us. We traded and interacted with each other in all kinds of ways that in many ways our current systems continue to make difficult to regenerate new collective sovereignties. And so I just wanted to say that as we think about even the particulars of tribal governments or tribal sovereignties, like I just want to and not even, to be frank, like I don't think it's even just tribal sovereignties. I think that there are real questions about how do human communities need to learn to live anew. And that we have to ask those big questions and try to work at it. And everyone's already named this in different ways, but I wanted to name that, like, we should transform our governance systems, right? Even if we had, and I think that we do need to think about understanding our traditional ways, but I also think that we have new conditions, and so we also need the space for our own knowledge systems to continue to evolve, whether they're through new songs or new ceremonies or new ways of understanding diplomacy, for example, given the new social structures that we're also navigating. All of those things, to me, are on the table and to take seriously. And I think that one of the things that happens is that the need, I think that I have to feed my kids dinner after this. And I need to feed them tomorrow. And so there's a pragmatism that I think is real for all of us. And I think that it's possible to both do that here and now kind of thing and think about the many worlds operating simultaneously that allows us to do all of that at once. And I guess what I would say is I'd be careful in thinking there's any one thing that isn't up for and may need to be reimagined and dreamed anew. And that doesn't mean that we're like getting rid of all the other things. Like I really love the idea that we learn the meanings of our old things in the ways that we live them now. And that's sort of what living is in many ways. So I just would caution everyone to think about, like, there are lots of possibilities, as I can imagine, for tribal nations and tribal governments that want to see the openings to growing sovereignty and self-determination on new terms. And, you know, I just want to be clear, the earth is going to be all right. It's going to figure it out. On the humility tip, it's humans that are that are really gonna have some issue. And unfortunately, we're gonna take some of our more than human kin along with us for being ridiculous. So I just think that sometimes assuming that anything is really settled is part of where we get sort of enclosed in pragmatics. So yeah, I just don't think that sovereignty is settled, I guess is what I'll say. And acting sovereign is not a settled thing.
I really appreciate and love the framing that everyone is providing too, and I appreciate the fact that this panel is really just at the core calling for an epistemological shift on how we're engaging with education, with higher education in particular. And one of the questions that I received in a private message outside the main chat, I think also evokes a concern that I have too, is that some of this conversation and the reimaginings that we hear here and not necessarily here, but also around higher education as we're in this moment of federal retrenchment and collapse, sound like also the ways we were talking about reimagining education during COVID. And we were talking about, well, after COVID, everything's going to be different and things are going to change in higher education. We're going to have this expanded view and possibility. And then all of a sudden it was, well, we need to get back to normal and there needs to be a new normal. And this is just, we need to get back to the way things were before, right? And this call for retrenchment that has this kind of implicit appeal to the present generation because people don't think about who's next, right? They just want to go back to the way things are more comfortable for them now. And so, what do you think that and so the question from the chat is like, what do you think that we missed and why does it seem as though we reverted back to how we were doing educationally before the pandemic? And probably more importantly, how do we avoid missing the opportunity of now in regressing to just whatever we had before, the current crisis?
It's a really good question. I don't know if I have a great answer for it, the kind of answer that it deserves. Part of what I would say to you is I think that, yes, there's an epistemological framing here. I think Megan's earlier comments about the role of knowledge and the control of knowledge is important in it. But I also think that there are ontological and axiological and cosmological / eschatological issues attached to this around our realities. And I think there's an important piece here, I think, about what COVID did for us in terms of having a moment to I'm going to say this, but I don't think it's the right word, particularly given the fact that it's COVID, a moment to breathe and to reflect and to kind of reimagine what a world might look like. And I think that there was a kind of a magical space for a group of folks that I was in deep conversation with, including you, Jeremiah, and Sabina Vaught, as we were writing a book, and Megan and a few others as we were meeting weekly around what would it look like to move toward a vision of abundance, and not abundance in the way it's been taken up more recently, but what would it mean for everyone to have enough to thrive? What would it mean to disrupt larger questions about control over resources, whether it's knowledge or other kinds of things? And that for me was a value-based, that's the axiological components of this for me. But I think as we look forward, and it's not really an eschatological piece because I think eschatological is about ends of time, as I understand it. But I think it's about this. Megan and Amanda and Eva, I think, and Sandy are really asking us to like stretch out our time frame for thinking about this. So I tend to think that we're responsible to our ancestors for the gifts that they've given us, and we're responsible for our descendants and creating the conditions for our descendants to be able to thrive. There's a real question for me about whether or not we're doing that now and whether or not we're actually thriving. But the return to business as usual is one of the, for me, like a fundamental regret about how higher education worked. And what I found really powerful in a moment of being able to reflect with colleagues is to be able to dream and to imagine. And I that's what actually I think higher education does better than a lot of places, is to imagine and to dream. And so I think we've lost the narrative about college being about just preparing a workforce, which is kind of this narrative, as opposed to what does it mean to create people who will contribute to a society. Where I started with Haudenosaunee people, so that we're making people who are good for a lot of things, not just for themselves, but for us all, and for a collective, and for moving away from just a rabid focus on individual rights and responsibilities to thinking about collective rights and responsibilities, but also thinking about collective futures, and not just human collective futures, as Megan is just reminding us, but it's a collective future of the future of the planet becomes really important.
I appreciate everybody percolating on Brian's words there and thinking about how these times and the idea of a collective future, I think, is really important, but also to, emphasize Megan's point, the future of the planet's going to keep spinning for a little bit. It's us spinning on it who are, losing our focus maybe a little bit, right? And so I appreciate the thoughts and calling in of the conversation for everybody in thinking about our collective shared responsibility to each other and to education writ large. There was another question in the chat too about how this you think transfers or cross applies to the K through 12 spaces as well. Because I mean, the conversation is ostensibly about higher education, but in thinking about COVID too, there's a part of me which goes way to brainworm, Tylenol, galaxy brain conspiracy theorist on everything, remembering that right before COVID happened was massive teacher strikes. And we were seeing teachers rise up in places and in ways that we hadn't seen teachers rise up before. And suddenly, guess who was most affected by COVID? It's teachers who are forced out of their classrooms and their spaces of organizing and cultural production and change that are changing this. And so, as much as we're focusing this conversation on higher ed, do you see any differences or connections or ramifications for K through 12 that you feel like are important to highlight here as we're talking about this epistemological and all the good illogicals that Professor Brayboy brought up for us, that I think are really important to make these connections between higher and K through 12 education.
I'll say something about this I'd really love to hear what everyone else thinks, but like it is such a short time that the possibility of PK-12 education was for our well-being, if ever. I tell people all the time, until our young people can go to school in our own languages, like we're still talking about a school system that is not for us, it's for them, right? I think broadly, though, we are also seeing, and why we're seeing the teacher strikes, is that I think the limits of our current approach to raising young people. So I want to be clear about this, is that K-12 systems are systems of child rearing, right? And deciding what people should learn, how they should learn it, why they should learn it, where they should learn it, and who should teach it. It is really around like infrastructuring future imaginings of society and peoples. So I think the reason that we're seeing a full-scale dismantling of K-12 is because of the power of that. And while I think I am not convinced that we'll see a rapid rebuilding of K-12 public education, to be honest, I am not sure that we will see that. I think we will continue to see higher ed persist. And this is not to say the rebuildings in parallels. Like I'm talking about the current systems of higher ed. I think it's going to persist, but I think we're going to have a new economic model. And I don't know that we're going to like the new economic model of it. I don't know that all of K-12 public education will really persist forward. It's been decades of a remaking of it, right? And clamping down on it, and a particular form of knowledge limiting that has been going on for a really long time. So the biggest thing to me, I'll just tell you, like we live in a country where actually compulsory attendance laws governs K-12 education. You're criminalized if you don't send your kids to school. And Native communities know that really well. But I don't often think broader publics realize like, oh, you are criminalized if you do not send your children to school. It's called child neglect, right? And there are really limited pathways to do what you want, but there are pragmatic mechanisms that if people wanted to figure them out, we could proliferate new models of what that looks like and try it. So I would just say that I think that teachers reaching the limits and the sort of ways, if we understand what's been happening to K-12 educators for a while, is that they feel it in their bones. Even if they don't quite understand it, they've been feeling it for a while and been like, this is not a way to build a healthy society or raise healthy children. So to me, again, I would say like, that sounds pessimistic, but I actually think it's kind of that there is a kind of readiness, right? And I think we heard it, we can see it in our undergraduate students or even our graduate students in higher ed. But I think there is lots of human hunger for something different. And I just think it requires a clear-eyed view of the histories and purposes of the systems that we've been participating in, and maybe with a hope of it becoming something else. That yeah, I mean, I do it too, but I always have, for me, I have to have a couple of things moving, because any one thing, the limits of it are really clear to me. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I would just say to folks, like, I don't know if we're going to see a reordering of K-12 public schools. I don't. And I think we see it in the courts, right? The courts are not upholding the right to education or the right to being literate. And that's not the first time in this country where it being illegal to be literate, it won't be, right? Like, there are lots of ways to start to understand the ways that the legal structuring of this is at play again.
I wanted to also uplift that I'm really excited and fortunate to be at Eugene, Oregon now. Eugene School District 4J was the first school that enacted a lawsuit against Trump when the DEI stuff was coming down, and they won it. And so I just want to uplift the power of collective organizing that I've seen firsthand in the state and with the teachers here and the staff. And they're doing things beyond schools. They're fighting for the livelihood of their children and families. And I feel like we can learn a lot when we look at collective organizing and open our filters that's beyond school settings to see the communities that are in alongside these schools. And that gives me a sense of like, let's get our fist up. Time is now.
I think that's the perfect note to end it on. And thank you, Amanda and Megan, for the comments here. I think for me, so much of our conversation is not only inspiring, but even those parts which to some might seem a downer or a pessimism are in fact just like an astute realism that grounds us in this moment for what comes next. And I really appreciate that. Very much reminds me of the ways in which Derek Bell talks about the permanence of racism, not as a nihilism or as a reason to give up, but in an understanding that this is a struggle that we engage in collectively. And so I appreciate all of our panelists. And so I'm going to say thanks and turn it over to Isaac to close us out.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a really amazing panel, and I just want to thank all of the presenters for their insight and for the challenge and the optimism and the real analysis. And, you know, as Joe Hill says, don't mourn, organize. I think that it's really that I would first of all like to remind or to thank the presenters, the Center for Defense of Academic Freedom, the Scholars for a New Deal in Higher Education, and the Critical Legal Collective. And I'd also like to extend an invitation to anybody on this panel who's interested and able to attend. There's going to be a symposium at Boston Law on November 14th called Democracy in Higher Education. It's designed as a way to continue this project forward in terms of thinking about possible new futures, to think about the real obstacles that are facing higher education, especially around how to imagine new kinds of political economies of higher education, new ways of regulating and governing academic institutions. And I hope that, I know that this conversation will carry forward with me in that space, but I hope that there'll be lots of other folks from this panel and the audience who are able to join. I'm really taking away the message that came across in lots of different ways, but this question of temporality and time, and I think Professor Bang asked us to be deliberate about the scale at which we're thinking, that to think more than a lifetime or a future that's contained, but also not pie in the sky, infinite, unfocused, but how do you navigate that? What is doable, but also what is possible, and how to um, navigate that space of temporalities and pluralities that are moving in lots of different directions at lots of different speeds and lots of different spaces, forward, behind, future. And I think that, I'm going to ask myself, moving forward, what is worth our breath and what are our new songs? I think that's what I'm taking away. So just thank you to the panel, and thank you for the um, the the clarity and the optimism and the incredibly critical analysis. So thank you. Thanks everybody for spending their time, and I look forward to being in solidarity and collaboration with everybody, moving forward. So thank you.